Hi everyone, this is Robert. Welcome to The Well-Told Tale. Every week we bring you the finest science fiction and fantasy stories ever written. Today we have a classic science fiction short story, The Thing from Outside by George Allan England. Although perhaps less well known today, in its day it was very highly regarded, appearing in the first ever edition of Amazing Stories magazine in 1926, alongside other luminaries such as H.G. Wells, Edgar Allan Poe and Jules Verne. It still captures the imagination today. It's time to pull up a chair, relax and enjoy The Thing from Outside by George Allan England. They sat about their campfire, that little party of Americans retreating southward from Hudson Bay before the oncoming menace of the Great Cold, sat there stolid under the awe of the North, under the uneasiness that the day's trek had laid upon their souls. The three men smoked. The two women huddled close to each other. Fireglow picked their faces from the gloom of the night among the dwarf firs. A splashing murmur told of the Albany River's haste to escape from the wilderness and reach the bay. "I don't see what there was in a mere circular print on a rock ledge to make our guides desert," said Professor Thorburn. His voice was as dry as his whole personality. "Most extraordinary." "They knew what it was, all right," answered Jandron, geologist of the party. "So do I." He rubbed his cropped moustache. His eyes glinted greyly. "I've seen prints like that before. That was on the Labrador, and I've seen things happen where they were." "Something surely happened to our guides before they'd got a mile into the bush," put in the professor's wife, while Vivian, her sister, gazed into the fire that revealed her as a beauty, not to be spoiled even by a tam and a rough-knit sweater. "Men don't shoot wildly and scream like that unless—" "They're all three dead now, anyhow," put in Jandron, "so they're out of harm's way. We're 250 wicked miles from the CPR rails." "Oh, forget it, Jandy," said Ma, the journalist. "We're just suffering from an attack of nerves, that's all. Give me a fill of baccy. Thanks. We'll all be better in the morning. Oh, ho-hum. Now, speaking of spooks and such..." He launched into an account of how he had once exposed a fraudulent spiritualist, thus proving to his own satisfaction that nothing existed beyond the scope of mankind's everyday life. But nobody gave him much heed, and silence fell upon the little night encampment in the wilds, a silence that was ominous. Pale, cold stars watched down from spaces infinitely far beyond man's trivial world. Next day, stopping for chow on a ledge miles upstream, Jandron discovered another of the prints. He cautiously summoned the other two men. They examined the print while the women folk were busy by the fire. A harmless thing, the marking seemed, only a ring about 4 inches in diameter, a kind of cup-shaped depression with a raised centre. A sort of glaze coated it, as if the granite had been fused by heat. Jandron knelt, a well-knit figure in bright mackinaw and canvas leggings, and with a shaking finger explored the smooth curve of the print in the rock. His brows contracted as he studied it. "We'd better get along out of this as quick as we can," he said in an unnatural voice. "You've got your wife to protect, Thorburn, and I've got Vivian, and—" "You have," nipped Ma. The light of an evil jealousy gleamed in his heavy-lidded look. "What you need is an alienist." "Oh, really, Jandron," the professor admonished. "You mustn't let your imagination run away with you." "I suppose it's imagination that keeps this print cold," the geologist retorted. His breath made faint, swirling coils of vapour above it. "Nothing but a pothole," judged Thorburn, bending his square, angular body to examine the print. The professor's vitality all seemed centred in his big bulged skull that sheltered a marvellous thinking machine. Now he put his lean hand to the base of his brain, rubbing the back of his head as if it ached. Then, under what seemed some powerful compulsion, he ran his bony finger around the print in the rock. "By Jove, it is cold," he admitted, "and looks as if it'd been stamped right out of the stone. Extraordinary." "Dissolved out, you mean," corrected the geologist, "by cold." The journalist laughed mockingly. "Wait till I write this up," he sneered. "Noted geologist declares frigid ghost dissolves granite." Jandron ignored him. He fetched a little water from the river and poured it into the print. "Ice!" ejaculated the Professor. "Solid ice!" "Frozen in a second," added Jandron, while Ma frankly stared. "And it'll never melt either, I'll tell you. I've seen some of these rings before, and every time horrible things have happened. Incredible things. Something burned this ring out of the stone, burned it out with the cold interstellar space, something that can import cold as a permanent quality of matter, something that can kill matter and totally remove it." "Of course, that's all sheer poppycock," the journalist tried to laugh, but his brain felt numb. "This something, this thing," continued Jandron, "is a thing that can't be killed by bullets. It's what caught our guides in the barrens as they ran away. Poor fools." A shadow fell across the print in the rock. Mrs. Thorburn had come up, was standing there. She had overheard a little of what Jandron had been saying. "Nonsense," she tried to exclaim, but she was shivering so she could hardly speak. That night, after a long afternoon of paddling and portaging, labouring against inhibitions like those in a nightmare, they camped on shelving rocks that slanted to the river. "After all," said the Professor, when supper was done, "we mustn't get into a panic. I know extraordinary things are reported from the wilderness, and more than one man has come out raving, but we, by Jove, with our superior brains, we aren't going to let nature play us any tricks. And of course," added his wife, her arm about Vivian, "everything in the universe is a natural force. There really is no supernatural at all." "Admitted," Jandron replied, "but how about things outside the universe?" "And they call you a scientist," jibed Ma, but the Professor leaned forward, his brows knit. He grunted. A little silence fell. "You don't mean, really," asked Vivian, "that you think there's life and intelligence outside?" Jandron looked at the girl. Her beauty, haloed with ruddy gold from the firelight, was a pain to him as he answered, "Yes, I do, and dangerous life, too. I know what I've seen in the North Country. I know what I've seen." Silence again, save for the crepitation of the flames, the fall of an ember, the murmur of the current. Darkness narrowed the wilderness to just that circle of flickering light ringed by the forest and the river, brooded over by the pale stars. "Of course, you can't expect a scientific man to take you seriously," commented the Professor. "I know what I've seen. I'll tell you, there's something entirely outside man's knowledge." "Oh, poor fellow," scoffed the journalist, but even as he spoke, his hand pressed his forehead. "There are things at work," Jandron affirmed with dogged persistence. He lighted his pipe with a blazing twig. Its flame revealed his face, drawn, lined. "Things. Things that reckon with us no more than we do with ants. Less, perhaps." The flame of the twig died. Night stood closer, watching. "Suppose there are," the girl asked. "What's that got to do with these prints in the rock?" "They," answered Jandron, "are marks left by one of those things. Footprints, maybe. That thing is near us, here and now." Ma's laugh broke a long stillness. "And you?" he exclaimed, "with an A.M. and a B.S. to write after your name?" "If you knew more," retorted Jandron, "you'd know a devilish sight less. It's only ignorance that's cocksure." "But," dogmatized the Professor, "no scientist of any standing has ever admitted any outside interference with this planet. No, and for thousands of years nobody ever admitted that the world was round either. What I've seen, I know." "Well, what have you seen?" asked Mrs. Thorburn, shivering. "You'll excuse me, please, for not going into that just now." "You mean," the Professor demanded dryly, "if this superstitious thing wants to... It'll do any infernal thing it takes a fancy to. Yes, if it happens to want us. But what could things like that want of us? Why should they come here at all? Oh, for various reasons, for inanimate objects at times, and then again for living beings. They've come here lots of times, I tell you, Chandran asserted with a strange irritation, and got what they wanted, and then gone away to somewhere. If one of them happens to want us for any reason, it will take us. That's all. If it doesn't want us, it will ignore us, as we'd ignore gorillas in Africa if we were looking for gold. But if it was gorilla fur we wanted, that would be different for the gorillas, wouldn't it? What in the world, asked Vivian, could a thing from outside want of us? What do men want, say, of guinea pigs? Men experiment with them, of course. Superior beings use inferior for their own ends. To assume that man is the supreme product of evolution is gross self-conceit. Might not some superior thing want to experiment with human beings? But how? Demanded Ma. The human brain is the most highly organised form of matter known to this planet. Suppose now... Nonsense, interrupted the Professor. All hands to the sleeping bags, and no more of this. I've got a wretched headache. Let's anchor in Blanket Bay. He and both the women turned in. Chandran and Ma sat a while longer by the fire. They kept plenty of wood piled on it, too, for an unnatural chill transfixed the night air. The fire burned strangely blue, with greenish flicks of flame. At length, after vast moments of disagreement, the geologist and the newspaper man sought their sleeping bags. The fire was a comfort. Not that a fire could avail a pin's weight against a thing from interstellar space, but subjectively it was a comfort. The instincts of 1,000,000 years centering around protection by fire cannot be obliterated. After a time, worn out by a day of nerve strain and of battling with swift currents, of flight from something invisible, intangible, they all slept. The depths of space, star-sprinkled, hung above them with a vastness immeasurable, cold beyond all understanding of the human mind. Chandran woke first, in a red dawn. He blinked at the fire as he crawled from his sleeping bag. The fire was dead, and yet it had not burned out. Much wood remained unconsumed, charred over, as if some gigantic extinguisher had, in the night, been lowered over it. Growled Chandran. He glanced about him on the edge. Prince, too. I might have known. He aroused Ma. Despite all the journalists' mocking hostility, Chandran felt more in common with this man of his own age than with the Professor, who was close on 60. Look here now, said he. It has been all around here. See, it put out our fire. Maybe the fire annoyed it in some way, and it walked around us everywhere. His grey eyes smouldered. I guess, by gad, you've got to admit facts now. The journalist could only shiver and stare. Lord, what a head I've got on me this morning, he chattered. He rubbed his forehead with a shaking hand and started for the river. Most of his assurance had vanished. He looked badly done up. Well, what say? Demanded Chandran. See these fresh prints? Oh, damn the prints, retorted Ma, and fell to grumbling some unintelligible thing. He washed unsteadily and remained crouching at the river's lip, inert, numbed. Chandran, despite a gnawing at the base of his brain, carefully examined the ledge. He found prints there, and some even on the river bottom near the shore. Wherever water had collected in the prints of the rock, it had frozen hard. Each print in the riverbed, too, was white with ice that the rushing current could not melt. Well, by gad, he exclaimed. He lighted his pipe and tried to think. Horribly afraid. Yes, he felt horribly afraid, but determined. Presently, as a little power of concentration came back, he noticed that all the prints were in straight lines, each marked about 2 feet from the next. It was observing us while we slept, said Chandran. What nonsense are you talking, eh? Demanded Ma. His dark, heavy face sagged. Fire now, and grub. He got up and shuffled unsteadily away from the river. Then he stopped with a jerk, staring. Look at that axe, he gulped, pointing. Chandran picked up the axe by the handle, taking good care not to touch the steel. The blade was white-furred with frost, and deep into it, punching out part of the edge, one of the prints was stamped. This metal, said he, is clean gone. It's been absorbed. The thing doesn't recognize any difference in materials. Water and steel and rock are all the same to it. "You're crazy," snarled the journalist. "How could a thing travel on one leg, hopping along, making marks like that?" "It could roll if it was disc-shaped, and—" A cry from the professor turned them. Thorburn was stumbling toward them, hand out and tremulous. "My wife," he choked. Vivian was kneeling beside her sister, frightened, dazed. "Something's happened," stammered the professor. "Here, come here." Mrs. Thorburn was beyond any power of theirs to help. She was still breathing, but her respirations were stertorous, and a complete paralysis had stricken her. Her eyes, half-opened and expressionless, showed pupils startlingly dilated. No resources of the party's drug kit produced the slightest effect on the woman. The next half-hour was a confused panic, breaking camp, getting Mrs. Thorburn into a canoe and leaving that accursed place, with a furious energy of terror that could no longer reason. Upstream, ever against the swirl of the current, the party fought, driven by horror. With no thought of food or drink, paying no heed to landmarks, lashed forward only by the mad desire to be gone, the three men and the girl flung every ounce of their energy into the paddles. Their panting breath mingled with the sound of swirling eddies. A mist-blurred sun brooded over the northern wilds. Unheeded, hosts of black flies sang high-pitched keenings all about the fugitives. On either hand, the forest waited, watched. Only after 2 hours of sweating toil had brought exhaustion did they stop, in the shelter of a cove where black waters circled foam-flecked. There they found the professor's wife. She was dead. Nothing remained to do but bury her. At first, Thorburn would not hear of it. Like a madman, he insisted that through all hazards he would fetch the body out, but no, impossible. So, after a terrible time, he yielded. In spite of her grief, Vivian was admirable. She understood what must be done. It was her voice that said the prayers, her hand that, lacking flowers, laid the fir boughs on the cairn. The professor was dazed past doing anything, saying anything. Toward mid-afternoon, the party landed again, many miles upriver. Necessity forced them to eat. Firs would not burn. Every time they lighted it, it smouldered and went out with a heavy, greasy smoke. The fugitives ate cold food and drank water, then shoved off in 2 canoes and once more fled. In the 3rd canoe, hauled to the edge of the forest, lay all of the rock specimens, data and curios, scientific instruments. The party kept only Ma's diary, a compass, supplies, firearms and medicine kit. "We can find the things we've left, sometime," said Jandron, noting the place well. "Sometime after it has gone." "And bring the body out," added Thorburn. Tears, for the first time, wet his eyes. Vivian said nothing. Ma tried to light his pipe. He seemed to forget that nothing, not even tobacco, would burn now. Vivian and Jandron occupied 1 canoe. The other carried the professor and Ma. Thus, the power of the 2 canoes was about the same. They kept well together, upstream. The fugitives paddled and portaged with a dumb, desperate energy. Toward evening, they struck into what they believed to be the Mamatawan. A mile up this, as the blurred sun faded beyond a wilderness of ominous silence, they camped. Here they made determined efforts to kindle fire. Not even alcohol from the drug kit would start it. Cold, they mumbled a little food. Cold, they huddled into their sleeping bags, there to lie with darkness leaden on their fear. After a long time, up over a world void of all sound save the river flow, slid an amber moon notched by the ragged tops of the conifers. Even the wail of a timber wolf would have come as welcome relief, but no wolf howled. Silence and night enfolded them, and everywhere they felt that it was watching. Foolishly enough, as a man will do foolish things in a crisis, Jandron laid his revolver outside his sleeping bag in easy reach. His thought, blurred by a strange drawing headache, was, if it touches Vivian, I'll shoot. He realized the complete absurdity of trying to shoot a visitant from interstellar space, from the 4th dimension maybe, but Jandron's ideas seemed tangled. Nothing would come right. He lay there, absorbed in a kind of waking nightmare. Now and then, rising on an elbow, he hearkened, all in vain. Nothing so much as stirred. His thought drifted to better days, when all had been health, sanity, optimism, when nothing except jealousy of Ma, as concerned Vivian, had troubled him. Days when the sizzle of the frying pan over friendly coals had made friendly wilderness music, when the wind and the northern star, the whir of the reel, the whispering vortex of the paddle in clear water had all been things of joy. Yes, and when a certain happy moment had, through some word or look of the girl, seemed to promise his heart's desire. But now, damn it, I'll save her anyhow, he swore with savage intensity, knowing all the while that what was to be would be. Do ants, by any waving of antenna, stay the down-crushing foot of man? Next morning, and the next, no sign of the thing appeared. Hope revived that possibly it might have flitted away elsewhere, back perhaps to outer space. Many were the miles the urging paddles spurned behind. The fugitives calculated that a week more would bring them to the railroad. Fire burned again. Hot food and drink helped wonderfully. But where were the fish? Most extraordinary. All at once, said the professor at noonday camp. He had become quite rational again. Do you realize, Jandron, we've seen no traces of life in some time? The geologist nodded. Only too clearly he had noted just that, but he had been keeping still about it. That's so, too, chimed in Ma, enjoying the smoke that some incomprehensible turn of events was letting him have. Not a muskrat or beaver, not even a squirrel or bird. Not so much as a gnat or blackfly, the professor added. Jandron suddenly realised he would have welcomed even those. That afternoon, Ma fell into a suddenly vile temper. He mumbled curses against the guides, the current, the portages, everything. Vivian complained of an oppressive headache. Jandron gave her the last of the aspirin tablets, and as he gave them, took her hand in his. "I'll see you through this, anyhow," said he. "I don't count now. Nobody counts, only you." She gave him a long, silent look. He saw the sudden glint of tears in her eyes, felt the pressure of her hand, and knew they two had never been so near each other as in that moment under the shadow of the unknown. Next day, or it may have been 2 days later, for none of them could be quite sure about the passage of time, they came to a deserted lumber camp. Even more than 2 days might have passed, because now their bacon was all gone, and only coffee, tobacco, beef cubes, and pilot bread remained. The lack of fish and game had cut alarmingly into the duffel bag. That day, whatever day it may have been, all 4 of them suffered terribly from headache of an odd ring-shaped kind, as if something circular were being pressed down about their heads. The professor said it was the sun that made his headache. Vivian laid it to the wind and the gleam of the swift water, while Ma claimed it was the heat. Jandron wondered at all this, inasmuch as he plainly saw that the river had almost stopped flowing, and the day had become still and overcast. They dragged their canoes up a rotting stage of fir poles and explored the lumber camp, a mournful place set back in an old slash, now partly overgrown with scrub poplar, maple and birch. The log buildings, covered with tar paper, partly torn from the polar roofs, were the usual North Country type. Obviously the place had not been used for years. Even the landing stage, where once logs had been rolled into the stream, had sagged to decay. "I don't quite get the idea of this," Ma exclaimed. "Where did the logs go to? Downstream, of course, but that would take them to Hudson Bay, and there's no market for spruce timber or pulpwood at Hudson Bay." He pointed down the current. "You're entirely mistaken," put in the professor. "Any fool could see this river runs the other way. A log thrown in here would go down the St. Lawrence." "But then," asked the girl, "why can't we drift back to civilization?" The professor retorted, "Just what we have been doing, all along. Extraordinary that I have to explain the obvious." He walked off in a huff. "I don't know that he's right at that," half admitted the journalist. "I've been thinking almost the same thing myself the past day or two. That is, ever since the sun shifted." "What do you mean, shifted?" said Jandron. "You haven't noticed it?" "But there's been no sun at all for at least 2 days." "Hanged if I'll waste time arguing with a lunatic," Ma growled. He vouchsafed no explanation of what he meant by the sun's having shifted, but wandered off, grumbling. "What are we going to do?" the girl appealed to Jandron. The sight of her solemn, frightened eyes, of her palm-outward hands, and, at last, her very feminine fear, constricted Jandron's heart. "We're going through, you and I," he answered simply. "We've got to save them from themselves, you and I have." Their hands met again, and for a moment held. Despite the dead calm, a fir tip at the end of the clearing suddenly flicked aside, shriveled as if frozen, but neither of them saw it. The fugitives, badly spent, established themselves in the bar room or sleeping shack of the camp. They wanted to feel a roof over them again, if only a broken one. The traces of men comforted them. A couple of broken peavies, a pair of snowshoes with the thongs all gnawed off, a cracked bit of mirror, a yellowed almanac dated 1899. Jandron called the professor's attention to this almanac, but the professor thrust it aside. "What do I want of a Canadian census report?" he demanded, and fell to counting the bunks over and over again. His big bulge of his forehead, that housed the massive brain of him, was oozing sweat. Ma cursed what he claimed was sunshine through the holes in the roof, though Jandron could see none, claimed the sunshine made his head ache. "But it's not a bad place," he added, "for we can make a blaze in that fireplace and be comfy. I don't like that window, though." "What window?" asked Jandron. "Where?" Ma laughed and ignored him. Jandron turned to Vivian, who had sunk down on the deacon seat and was staring at the stove. "Is there a window there?" he demanded. "Don't ask me," she whispered. I don't know." With a very thriving fear in his heart, Jandron peered at her for a moment. He fell to muttering. "I'm Wallace Jandron, 37 Ware Street, Cambridge, Massachusetts. I'm quite sane, and I'm going to stay so. I'm going to save her. I know perfectly well what I'm doing, and I'm sane, quite sane." After a time of confused and purposeless wrangling, they got a fire going and made coffee. This and cube bouillon with hardtack helped considerably. The camp helped too. A house, even a poor and broken one, is a wonderful barrier against a thing from outside. Presently darkness folded down. The men smoked, thankful that tobacco still held out. Vivian lay in a bunk that Jandron had piled with spruce boughs for her and seemed to sleep. The professor fretted like a child over the blisters his paddle had made upon his hands. Ma laughed now and then, though what he might be laughing at was not apparent. Suddenly he broke out, "After all, what should it want of us?" "Our brains, of course," the professor answered sharply. "That lets Jandron out," the journalist mocked. "But," added the professor, "I can't imagine a thing callously destroying human beings, and yet—" He stopped short with surging memories of his dead wife. "What was it," Jandron asked, "that destroyed all those people in Spain, that time so many of them died in a few minutes after having been touched by an invisible something that left a slight red mark on each? The newspapers were full of it." "Oh, piffle," yawned Man. "I tell you," insisted Jandron, "there are forms of life as superior to us as we are to ants. We can't see 'em. No ant ever saw a man. And did any ant ever form the least conception of a man? These things have left thousands of traces all over the world. If I had my reference books—" "Tell that to the Marines." "Charles Fort, the greatest authority in the world on unexplained phenomena," persisted Jandron, "gives innumerable cases of happenings that science can't explain in his Book of the Damned. He claims this earth was once a no-man's land where all kinds of things explored and colonized and fought for possession, and he says that now everyone's warned off except the owners. I happen to remember a few sentences of his. In the past, inhabitants of a host of worlds have dropped here, hopped here, wafted here, sailed, flown, motored, walked here, have come singly, have come in enormous numbers, have visited for hunting, trading, mining. They have been unable to stay here, have made colonies here, have been lost here." "Oh, poor fish to believe that," mocked the journalist, while the professor blinked and rubbed his bulging forehead. "I do believe it," insisted Jandron. "The world is covered with relics of dead civilizations that have mysteriously vanished, leaving nothing but their temples and monuments." "Rubbish." How about Easter Island? How about all the gigantic works there and at 1,000 other places, Peru, Yucatan and so on, which certainly no primitive race ever built? That's thousands of years ago, said Ma, and I'm sleepy. For heaven's sake, can it? Oh, all right, but how explain things then? What the devil could one of those things want of our brains? Suddenly put in the Professor. After all, what? Well, what do we want of lower forms of life? Sometimes food, again some product or other, or just information. Maybe it is just experimenting with us, the way we poke an anthill. There's always this to remember, that the human brain tissue is the most highly organised form of matter in this world. Yes, admitted the Professor, but what... It might want brain tissue for food, for experimental purposes, for lubricant, how do I know? Jandron fancied he was still explaining things, but all at once he found himself waking up in one of the bunks. He felt horribly cold, stiff, sore. A sift of snow lay here and there on the camp floor where it had fallen in through holes in the roof. "Vivian?" he croaked hoarsely. "Thorben? Ma?" Nobody answered. There was nobody to answer. Jandron crawled with immense pain out of his bunk and blinked round with bleary eyes. All of a sudden he saw the Professor and gulped. The Professor was lying stiff and straight in another bunk on his back. His waxen face made a mask of horror. The open, standing eyes, with pupils immensely dilated, sent Jandron shuddering back. A livid ring marked the forehead that now sagged inward as if empty. "Vivian?" croaked Jandron, staggering away from the body. He fumbled to the bunk where the girl had lain. The bunk was quite deserted. On the stove, in which lay half-charred wood smothered out as if by some noxious gas, still stood the coffee pot. The liquid in it was frozen solid. Of Vivian and the journalist, no trace remained. Along one of the sagging beams that supported the roof, Jandron's horror-blasted gaze perceived a straight line of frosted prints, ring-shaped, bitten deep. "Vivian! Vivian!" No answer. Shaking, sick, grey, half-blind with a horror not of this world, Jandron peered slowly around. The duffel bag and supplies were gone. Nothing was left but that coffee pot and the revolver at Jandron's hip. Jandron turned, then... a stare, his skull feeling empty as a burst drum. He crept lamely to the door and out into the snow. Snow. It came slanting down. From a grey sky it steadily filtered. The trees showed no leaf. Birches, poplars, rock maples all stood naked. Only the conifers drooped sickly green. In a little shallow across the river, snow lay white on the thin ice. Ice? Snow? Wrapped with terror, Jandron stared. Why then, he must have been unconscious 3 or 4 weeks. But how? Suddenly, all along the upper branches of trees that edged the clearing, puffs of snow flicked out. The geologist shuffled his 2 half-obliterated sets of footprints that wavered towards the landing. His body was leaden. He wheezed as he reached the river. The light, dim as it was, hurt his eyes. He blinked in a confusion that could just perceive one canoe was gone. He pressed a hand to his head, where an iron band seemed screwed up tighter. "Vivian! Ma! Hello?" Not even an echo. Silence clamped the world, silence and a cold that gnawed. Everything had gone a sinister grey. After a certain time, though time now possessed neither reality nor duration, Jandron dragged himself back to the camp and stumbled in. Heedless of the staring corpse, he crumpled down by the stove and tried to think, but his brain had been emptied of power. Everything blent to a grey blur. Snow kept slithering in through the roof. "Well, why didn't you come and get me, thing?" suddenly snarled Jandron. "Here I am! Damn you! Come and get me!" Voices. Suddenly he heard voices. Yes, somebody was outside there. Singularly aggrieved, he got up and limped to the door. He squinted out into the grey, saw 2 figures down by the landing. With numb indifference, he recognised the girl and Ma. Why should they bother me again? He nebulously wondered. Can't they go away and leave me alone? He felt peevish irritation. Then a modicum of reasoning returned. He sensed that they were arguing. Vivian, beside a canoe freshly dragged from thin ice, was pointing. Ma was gesticulating. All at once, Ma snarled, turned from her, plodded with bent back towards the camp. But listen, she called, her rough-knit sweater all powdered with snow. That's the way. She gestured downstream. I'm not going either way, Ma retorted. I'm going to stay right here. He came on bareheaded. Snow greyed his stubble of beard, but on his head it melted as it fell, as if some fever there had raised the brain stuff to improbable temperatures. I'm going to stay right here all summer. His heavy lids sagged. Puffy and evil, his lips showed a glint of teeth. Let me alone. Vivian lagged after him, kicking up the ash-like snow. With indifference, Jandron watched them. Trivial human creatures. Suddenly Ma saw him in the doorway and stopped short. He drew his gun. He aimed at Jandron. You get out, he mouthed. Why in? Can't you stay dead? Put that gun down, you idiot, Jandron managed to retort. The girl stopped and seemed trying to understand. We can't get away yet if we all stick together. Are you going to get out and leave me alone? Demanded the journalist, holding his gun steadily enough. Jandron, wholly indifferent, watched the muzzle. Vague curiosity possessed him. Just what, he wondered, did it feel like to be shot? Ma pulled the trigger. Snap! The cartridge missed fire. Not even powder would burn. Ma laughed horribly and shambled forward. Serves him right, he mouthed. He better not come back out again. Jandron understood that Ma had seen him fall, but he still felt himself standing there alive. He shuffled away from the door. No matter whether he was alive or dead, there was always Vivian to be saved. The journalist came to the door, paused, looked down, grunted and passed into the camp. He shut the door. Jandron heard the rotten wooden bar of the latch drop. From within echoed a laugh, monstrous in its brutality. Then, quivering, the geologist felt a touch on his arm. Why did you desert us like that? He heard Vivian's reproach. Why? He turned, hardly able to see her at all. Listen, he said thickly, I'll admit anything. It's all right, but just forget it for now. We've got to get out of here. The professor is dead in there, and Ma's gone mad and barricaded himself in there, so there's no use staying. There's a chance for us yet. Come along. He took her by the arm and tried to draw her towards the river, but she held back. The hate in her face sickened him. He shook in the grip of a mighty chill. Go with you, she demanded. Yes, by God, he retorted in a swift blaze of anger, or I'll kill you where you stand. It shan't get you anyhow. Swiftly piercing, a greater cold smote to his inner marrows. A long row of the cup-shaped prints had just appeared in the snow beside the camp, and from these marks wafted a faint, bluish vapour of unthinkable cold. What are you staring at? The girl demanded. Those prints in the snow. There, see! He pointed a shaking finger. How can there be snow at this season? He could have wept for the pity of her, the love of her. On her tangle of rebel hair, her sweater, the snow came steadily drifting, yet there she stood before him and prated of summer. Jandron heaved himself out of a very slough of down-dragging lassitudes. He whipped himself into action. Summer, winter, no matter, he flung at her. You're coming along with me. He seized her arm with the brutality of desperation that must hurt to save, and murder too lay in his soul. He knew that he would strangle her with his naked hands if need were, before he would ever leave her there for it to work its horrible will upon. You come with me, he mouthed, or by the Almighty... Ma's scream in the camp whirled him toward the door. That scream rose higher, higher, even more piercing, just like the screams of the runaway Indian guides in what now appeared the infinitely long ago. It seemed to last hours, and always it rose as if being wrung out of a human body by some kind of agony not conceivable in this world. Higher, higher... Then it stopped. Jandron hurled himself against the plank door. The bar smashed, the door shivered inward. With a cry, Jandron recoiled. He covered his eye with a hand that quivered claw-like. "Go away, Vivian, don't come here, don't look." He stumbled away, babbling. Out of the door crept something like a man, a queer, broken, bent-over thing, a thing crippled, shrunken and flabby, that whined. This thing, yes, it was still Ma, crouched down at one side, quivering, whimpering. It moved its hands as a crushed ant moves its antennae, jerkily, without significance. All at once, Jandron no longer felt afraid. He walked quite steadily to Ma, who was breathing in little gasps. From the camp issued an odour unlike anything terrestrial. A thin greyish grease covered the sill. Jandron caught hold of the crumpling journalist's arm. Ma's eyes leered, filmed, unseeing. He gave the impression of a creature whose back has been broken, whose whole essence and energy had been wrenched asunder, yet in which life somehow clings, a creature vivisected. Away through the snow, Jandron dragged him. Ma made no resistance, just let himself be led, whining a little, palsied, rickety, shattered. The girl, her face whitely cold as the snow that fell on it, came after. Thus they reached the landing at the river. "Come now, let's get away." Jandron made shift to articulate. Ma said nothing, but when Jandron tried to bundle him into a canoe, something in the journalist revived with swift, mad hatefulness. That something lashed him into a spasm of wiry, incredibly venomous resistance. Slavers of blood and foam streaked Ma's lips. He made horrid noises like an animal. He howled dismally and bit, clawed, writhed and grovelled. He tried to sink his teeth into Jandron's leg. He fought appallingly, as men must have fought in the inconceivably remote days before even the Stone Age, and Vivian helped him. Her fury was a tiger cat's. Between the pair of them, they almost did him in. They almost dragged Jandron down, and themselves too, into the black river that ran swiftly under the ice. Not till Jandron had quite flung off all vague notions and restraints of gallantry, not until he struck from the shoulder, to kill if need be, did he best them. He beat the pair of them unconscious, trussed them hand and foot with the painters of the canoes, rolled them into the larger canoe, and shoved off. After that, the blankness of a measureless oblivion descended. Only from what he was told, weeks after, in the Royal Victoria Hospital at Montreal, did Jandron ever learn how and when a field squad of Dominion Forest had found them drifting in Lake Musawamkeag, and that knowledge filtered slowly into his brain during a period inchoate as Iceland fogs. That Ma was dead and the girl alive, that much, at all events, was solid. He could hold on to that. He could climb back with that to the real world again. Jandron climbed back, came back. Time healed him as it healed the girl. After a long, long while, they had speech together. Cautiously, he sounded her wells of memory. He saw that she recalled nothing. So he told her white lies about capsized canoes and the sad death, in realistically described rapids, of all the party except herself and him. Vivian believed. Fate, Jandron knew, was being very kind to both of them. But Vivian could never understand in the least why her husband, not very long after marriage, asked her not to wear a wedding ring, or any ring whatever. Men are so queer, covers a multitude of psychic agonies. Life for Jandron, life softened by Vivian, knit itself up into some reasonable semblance of a normal pattern. But when, at lengthening intervals, memories even now awake, memories crawling amid the slime of cosmic mysteries that it is madness to approach, or when at certain times Jandron sees a ring of any sort, his heart chills with the cold that reeks of the horrors of infinity. And from shadows past the boundaries of our universe seem to beckon things that, God grant, can never till the end of time be known on earth. and welcome back. I hope you enjoyed that classic science fiction short story. If you'd like to support The Well-Told Tale as we make these classics available for free to everyone, thank you. The best way to do that is through my Patreon page. There's a link in the description. I'll be back next week with the start of another longer story, this time from the grandfather of modern science fiction himself, H.G. Wells. I hope you can join me.